Good, good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is Saturday, at about 10:27. Hope everyone's doing good. It's a pretty cold winter day, winter start here in the morning. It got really cold last night. So yeah, I always like to start the shows with thanking people for checking out these videos. I did a big show yesterday or the day before yesterday on probably my probably my most prized possession as far as being a collector and lover of movies, but particularly around my Blu-rays that I own and Blu-rays that I seek out and Blu-rays that I feel are truly the most immersive experience that I have and particularly a film. The show that I did was on Apocalypse Now Redux, and that movie in particular is probably my most prized possession. I have the director's cut of that film, and it is simply spectacular. I mean, it is the definition for me of the greatest movie going experience in terms of just full on immersion. My favorite Blu-ray that I own in my collection. It is every time I see that film, it literally transports me to another world through sight and sound. So I did a show a day or two ago on that, and that's one of my all-time favorite films. So I always try to bring variety to this channel. I do lots of coverage. Most of the coverage of the movies that I do are on a lot of grindhouse movies, a lot of exploitation movies, a lot of lately the shows for the last few months. It's always been a thing, but especially the last few months, they've been mostly focused on a lot of films I've just discovered, for the first time, as well as lots of movies I have seen or that I grew up watching. But I shifted a lot of the focus on those shows, which is those videos make up the majority of the content, on really talking about all these amazing films that I've been discovering, particularly around like the underground, super low budget exploitation. A lot of films from that world, and it's been fabulous. But I try to always mix things up. I try to always do new things along the way. I constantly try to check out new films and revisit films that I love and discover new films, discover lots of older films. And then I try to do these specialty shows of where I, continue to try to bring as much variety as I can to this channel. My favorite portion and my favorite thing around this channel is usually always centered on doing the interview segments, and that for me is the most enjoyable part of doing this film fanatic whole this whole little adventure that I'm on. And I always want to thank everybody for their support, for listening to me talk and rant and describe the experiences and the connections that I have to these films, new movies I've discovered, especially lately. But again, I try to bounce back and forth and try to create a lot of variety and a lot of different content, but still having the focus being on more or less one particular thing. So I've always talked about my love of going to see, my favorite thing to do when I can do it, in my free time, is to go see live music, whatever that might be. It might be something might be really aware of, but my favorite thing, my favorite social activity, is to basically go out and see live music and have some drinks with some friends or whatnot, or go see some friends play music in various forms. There's lots of things like that here in Mid Coast, Maine. And thankfully, there's been more things like that happening here this winter, so it's been very cool. And my other favorite thing to do is to go to the movies. They're pretty much equal. I probably enjoy going to the movies more so than anything else in the world as far as activities in my free time. But due to well, mainly due to theaters closing and film and a lot of the films that are coming out in the theater, they seem to have less and less um, time in the theater. There is, for case in point, I just saw and read a little bit about this new M. Night Shyamalan movie. I think it's called A Knock at the Cabin, and it just came out, I think, last weekend, and I was interested in seeing it. I wasn't I mean, I love a lot of his films, and I think he's a great director, but I wasn't super pumped to see that movie. I wanted to see it, but I wasn't like, just I didn't have this feeling of just wanting to jump at it for some reason. But I definitely wanted to see it, and I do want to see it. And I remember, and it just came out. I saw the trailer in the theater, and the trailer looked really great. I think he's, as a director, M. Night Shyamalan's got a pretty cool track record for the most part. There's some of his films I think are really great, really original. But so I went to go to see if it was still playing in the theater here locally, and it was already gone. And I'm like, what the heck's that about? So the alternative that I saw was the new Ant-Man movie. I've done lots of coverage on all kinds of Marvel movies. Kind of the opposite, or the the most extreme opposite in terms of like a lot of the movies that I do cover on here. The real low budget horror films and whatnot. But I'm a huge comic book fan. Also, I've always been, when I was a kid, I was a huge avid collector of comic books. I'm a big fan of the MCU overall, especially Marvel. I do like some DC movies, and my favorite characters are probably more tied to the uh, the DC world, particularly Batman and the Joker. But Marvel, I felt my whole attitude around it has definitely changed quite a bit. It's almost where kind of where I'm at now. It's almost changed completely. But I think as a whole, I felt I've always felt that Marvel has a more consistent universe. I felt like they have just a stronger body of work than DC. And I've seen all of them for the most part. There's been a few that came out late last year that I have not seen, but it's been an interesting, almost a flip flop kind of feeling that I have now on where my relationship to comic book movies. It's hard to believe that there's now, just within the Marvel universe, there's officially over 30 movies um, that have been made in that universe, which is completely insane when you think of it. And in the big scheme of things, there's no end in sight. There's still gonna be who knows how many more coming down the pike. And also now, it was announced recently that James Gunn, who I think is one of the best directors around, he's always been one of my favorite directors. He was responsible for the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, which I really love. Particularly, I really love the first one. But he's an amazing director. With his film Slither, The Super, and also I thought what he did with the Suicide Squad a year or two ago that came out, which I think is just a phenomenal movie, so underrated, so underappreciated, but just an awesome movie. I think everything he kind of touches is gold. But in recent news, basically it was basically announced that he is now running the DC studios. So he's in charge of redoing everything, and it was announced that I think over the span of the next 10 to 12 years, which is just mind-boggling, it was announced that of all of these new movies that are going to be coming out, and as well as TV shows. And as far as the MCU goes, the Marvel world, there's no end in sight. There's going to be, I think now what they call it, it's now in phase 5. So now they're introducing this whole other thing. They've been the thing that they've been focusing on now with the last few movies is this whole like multiverse um, platform. So now there are more and more characters being introduced. It's going off into this whole Phase 5 scenario. So they're trying to kind of continue. Obviously, they're continuing this whole massive, massive franchise, but they're trying to reinvent these entirely new universes through the multiverse, which is an added thing to a degree of an extra layer of science fiction, but it also has this other avenue where it's even more open ended, and it exposes you to even more worlds, and at least on paper, more worlds, more characters, more characterizations, more villains, more heroes, and all kinds of scenarios around that. And I've always been a huge fan. My favorite films, probably in the Marvel universe, are definitely the Avenger films. Not all of them, but the first one I think is a spectacular movie. The Avengers, as a whole, have always been, one of my, some of my favorite stories in the whole comic book mythology world, particularly in the Marvel world. Age of Ultron, I felt was a really underwhelming movie. I felt it was pretty subpar compared to the first one. I felt the writing wasn't as strong. James Spader, tremendous actor, but he took on the role of Ultron, who I thought was a really messy character, and I felt like it was an undercooked movie. It was underwhelming compared to the first one. And probably my two favorite Marvel movies is definitely the Infinity War. I thought that movie just knocked it out of the park. It's a phenomenal movie, completely blown away. And at the end of that film, I was kind of mystified as to what they could do after something so epic. And then Endgame came out, and I was just blown away by how they even raised the bar to a degree even higher and made it even more exciting. And I felt like it was a real stunning conclusion to this whole universe, particularly around the storyline and all of the characters related to Thanos, the great Titan. I thought it was pretty mesmerizing. And I always thought, okay, well, maybe, and I knew in the back of my head, from what I had read over the years, that this probably was not going to be the final curtain for the Marvel universe, because obviously from a financial standpoint it doesn't make sense for them to it's a massive cash cow, so there's no reason that they're going to end this whole thing. And with comic books, and I always thought this ever since I was a kid, there are millions of choices as far as storylines and plot lines, and also where you can take all of these characters, and you can reinvent these characters as you go. And I always thought, okay, the basic framework of a lot of these stories, particularly when I was a kid collecting comic books, these are these characters, these superheroes, and these villains are, our represent our kind of modern mythology, and it just lends itself to where it's an endless canvas, and the storylines and everything. I always thought as a kid, it's just a matter of time till these movies or these stories are made into movies, because it's an endless amount of fantasy, a ride that we could really go on, and it could be taken to incredible heights, especially with technology growing, and then eventually that did happen, and now we're almost 15 years into it, and it's wild. So after at the conclusion of Endgame, I felt there was like a significant feeling of closure, and okay, this is they did such a wonderful job tying this all together, and you know, alongside the Avenger films, I've been a big fan of most of the other Marvel movies. I think there's been some definitely some films that have been clunkers. I feel like films like the in particular the Iron Man franchise. The last two Iron Man movies I thought were overstuffed and really overly bloated films, and it really lost the core magic of what that first movie was with Robert Downey Jr. But for the most part, I enjoyed all of those films, and I do enjoy all those films. I have most of them. The past couple of years, I have most of them on Blu-ray. The other movie that has always been a standout movie for me, which is it's right up there with Infinity War or Endgame, is Thor's Ragnarok. I think that movie is kind of a masterpiece. I think those three films, Thor Ragnarok, I think Infinity War and Endgame, those three films for me, my own personal taste, are my favorite movies in the entire universe. And I think, going into those films, obviously, you need to have, probably a knowledge to a degree of what the hell is going on, where these characters are coming from, an origins. You need to have a general feel as to how these things came about. But I do think that those films are so well written and so well done and so well executed on lots of ways. And the use of CGI is pretty spectacular. I think those are my favorite films, and I feel like those films to a degree they're so well done that they they almost for me act as like standalone films. Like you could kind of go into them pretty cold, not really necessarily knowing the origins. Most of the other films, I also really am a big fan of the Spider-Man films. I think they with Tom Holland, I've always been a huge fan of Sam Raimi's work, and I thought what the work that he did with the Spider-Man movies was pretty phenomenal. Particularly around the first two. The third one was pretty terrible, but I thought, being that he himself, being an avid comic book fan, and I thought he did a brilliant job. But I really love Tom Holland. Tobey Maguire played the first Spider-Man, obviously, but I really love Tom Holland. I think that he might be my favorite Spider-Man, and I think all three of those films are pretty phenomenal. So, and I'm also a huge fan of the Captain America films. I particularly around the Winter Soldier and Civil War. I think those films are pretty phenomenal. They have such a level of intensity to them, and I kind of feel like those films are so strong also that you can go into them without really, having to be incredibly knowledgeable of, the origins of those characters, particularly around Captain America. Because I think those, at the end of the day, a movie, should be judged by a degree of like, obviously if it resonates with people, but if the writing is so good, a movie should be a thing where you can have that experience and go into it and without necessarily knowing anything about it and just have that experience of where it resonates with you, and it's something that you want to maybe revisit, or it's something you want to talk about with your friends, or something you want to see again or own, and it should be just that immersive experience. I mean, obviously, like I said, there's so many films now, 30 plus films in the whole world, that there are some movies in the Marvel universe that you do need to have some kind of knowledge, of the backstory and the origins of the stories. But But at the end of the day, I think those films that I mentioned are, those are the ones that are probably the most have the most resonance with people. They're the most memorable, and I think that they're at a higher level because of the writing and the craftsmanship put into those movies. And they're, they onto themselves are so strong just as films. So it shouldn't really matter, even a person who is walking off the street, if they're into, you know having a great film going experience, it shouldn't really matter what, genre or style or format that movie is presented in. It should be, just of something of high quality, and it resonates with you as the viewer, and it shouldn't really matter. And I think those films I mentioned are just, really great. And so at the end of, the conclusion of Endgame, I felt there was closure. I felt like there was this immense payoff, and things really felt on a high level that we arrived at, a definitive conclusion. But I knew, that there were going to be more movies coming out, and it was just a matter of time. And I remember after Endgame came out, there was like this lull of, okay, on one hand, it felt like, okay, we have the curtains have closed. There is conclusion to where things are going to go, or, where things are at now. And there was a little bit of a lull. There was a time, maybe 6 months to almost to a year, where suddenly there weren't any of, these Marvel movies coming out. And I think, there was a sense of, even though those films are the Avenger movies, particularly the last two, were so satisfying, there was a little bit of, maybe sadness, for at least for me, that had set in, kind of missing that feeling of having something to look forward to, because at that point it was, culturally it's something. If you're a fan of films, and particularly if you're a fan of comic book movies, it was something to. In the track record, I felt was really consistent, especially with Marvel. It was something to kind of look forward to every year, and every summer when a lot of these films were released. It became a way of life. So a little, I know for me, it was kind of melancholy, even though it was a satisfying experience with the conclusion of Endgame. A little bit of a melancholy feeling started to settle in. A little bit of sadness. I was like, oh, okay, you know, I couldn't see in my head where they could take it after that. Take the world, or this whole world that they had brought to you, you know, that they had introduced to you over the span of all of these years. But it also felt very satisfying. But I started to miss that. And then, within 6 months, 8 years, or 6 months, 8 years, 6 months to a year after Endgame, it was announced that there was going to be a third Spider-Man film. And like I said, I'm a big Tom Holland fan. I think he's a really great actor, and I think he's incredible as Spider-Man and Peter Parker. And I've always thought they really did a really interesting spin, and keeping things creative, and injecting new flavors into those films that kept it really exciting and engaging on a lot of cool levels. And it was announced that there was going to be a third Spider-Man into the multiverse, and I was, very excited. I thought the trailers looked really great. I really am a huge fan of the animated Spider-Man in the multi-universe that came out a few years back. I think that is, arguably, possibly the best version or film of Spider-Man I've ever seen. Aside from the live action films, I think it's just a tremendous movie. But I thought this new one looked really good. I thought it looked really ambitious. It looked like they were really going to go places that we have never seen before. They were going to be introducing this whole multiverse thing, of where suddenly it was going to be this presentation of more or less almost like a love letter to all things Spider-Man. All things Spider-Man in and everything that entails. A tribute to all the actors, all the incarnations of Spider-Man, all of the villains, all of the the timelines, referencing to a degree all of what's come before and where it was kind of moving towards. But it looked highly ambitious, and it looked like it was going to be really fresh and really exciting, and really giving you something new. And I was generally super excited to see that film. And when I eventually saw it, I was kind of blown away. I knew a couple of friends that saw it beforehand, and I was really taken aback by how much I really thoroughly enjoyed that film. It gave me that same feeling of watching Endgame, where it felt like it was a real conclusive thing. It was doing something totally unique, with the introduction, with the multiverse, and it generally felt like I've always been a huge Spider-Man fan ever since I was a kid. He's always been one of my favorite comic book characters, and I felt the feeling that I took away from that film was that I felt it was the kind of the creators of that film. They had given you a love letter. They created this love letter to all things Spider-Man, and to all the fans, to all of the films, to everything that's um, come about in that universe, and it just like paid respect to all of that. It recognized all of those different facets of that character, and it was like this love letter. And I felt it was just an amazing film. It was thrilling. It was incredibly exciting. It had a lot of tension to it. It dealt with a lot of interesting, complicated themes, and I thoroughly just thought that movie rocked. And then, and since then, there's been quite a few movies that have been coming out, and they just seem to come out. And I know of a few people that personally that are big Marvel fans, but they were expressing this level of where this fatigue was settling in, where they were just not excited anymore. To They were ready to kind of move on and not spend that time, not spend that, they felt those movies were conclusive. Okay, let's do something new, let's do something different. But there was a fatigue that set in. I have a good friend who at one point was a huge comic book movie fan, and a big fan of films in general, but especially around comic book movies. My friend Aaron Kirkpatrick, and we've seen lots of movies together over the years. And she was basically at that point done. She was like, I can't, I'm exhausted. I can't watch any more Marvel movies. I need to do something else. And she took an entire, literally she took like a break from watching anything that was related to that universe. And she still has that, view where she doesn't really watch them anymore. Doesn't have that interest. Isn't fired up about going to see those movies. And at the time I can understand it, because here we are 30, with 30 plus movies into it, closing into a degree of like 20 years of these movies. And there's, at the end of the day, there's no end in sight, as far as the end of these movies. But I didn't really feel that way, that, or strongly she did, about having this fatigue, and where I'm going to close that door. Or I'm just not interested anymore. I could understand it though more and more. And at one point I couldn't understand that, because I felt, well, the track record's really great. They're great movies. They're super entertaining. They're, you know, just great rides to go on. And that's how I viewed the universe itself. But I started to understand her attitude more and more about that, this idea of where there's like a serious kind of fatigue setting in, and a sense of exhaustion. And after Spider-Man, the last Spider-Man Into the Multiverse came out, there's been quite a few other movies that have come out. Shang-Chi, which came out last year. There's also been some DC movies. But as far as Marvel movies go, Shang-Chi had come out. There was the Black Widow movie that had come out, which was the first one. There was another movie called The Eternals, which came out. Um, and there was the Wonder Woman sequel that had come out. Um, and I believe I'm probably leaving one or two out. But since Spider-Man's come out, there's been a whole plethora of movies that have come out, and now they're just they're calling it Phase Five. So oh yeah, and Doctor Strange, which I haven't seen. Some of these movies I haven't seen, and also a new Thor movie, which came out last year, and it's kind of at this area, this area in the universe, in the Marvel universe, where they're like calling it Phase Five. So they introduced through Spider-Man, and also it was introduced through the Avenger movies, but with this introduction of the multiverse, and now you know the last Spider-Man really focused. The whole focus of that film was introducing us to that as a new environment for the viewers and for these characters. But it did such an amazing job with handling something that could have been a complete train wreck. They did such a great job with that, with the writing, the concept, the design, across the board. But that ushered in this whole idea or the scenario of Phase Five. So now it seems every movie that's come out, the movies I mentioned, the Eternals, Doctor Strange, and also this new Ant Man that I just saw yesterday. It's so heavily steeped in this whole kind of multiverse scenario, and I feel like officially now, for me as a fan, a huge hardcore fan of comic book movies and that whole mythology, I have generally lost significant interest in in these films, and I have really noticed that there's at one point every time I saw news or heard of news of a new film coming out, I would generally get so excited and I would go see them, no matter what. I would make it a point and I would go see them. And I notice now movies are still being pumped out and I haven't seen them. I just, or I've seen them, after they were in the theaters. One big example of that was the last Thor movie. I Love and Thunder. I felt Taki Waititi is one of my favorite directors. The great, amazing, insane director from New Zealand. I think he's just amazing. I mean, his best thing he ever did was what we do in the shadows, and also Thor Ragnarok. But just an amazing director. And I had heard from people, and just kind of the overall buzz that film was really, kind of a mess, a hot mess, and there was really, it was really um, an example of the train going off the tracks, and I just I don't know. And again, I have not seen it, so I can't make a total judgment call. But I heard from lots of resources of from different sources of people that I know, and we have a lot of the same tastes. And I saw a lot of reviews, but I mostly judge my feelings around people that I know personally and friends that have seen it. And the general thing was that it was kind of a train wreck. And I don't know. I at that time when that movie came out, I was not really excited about seeing it, even though I was at one point. I just felt that I felt that feeling of anticipation just kind of leave, and I was moving on to being more excited about seeing other films, in particularly like Ty West, with what the great horror director who's been around for quite a few years, but has done this, has in the last year or two has like introduced the world to this really cool modern horror franchise with X and Pearl, and now Maxine, that's going to be coming out. I think this year or later this year. I've been way more excited about things like that than say Marvel movies. But I never did see it. And I remember going after Spider Man. I did go see the Eternals in the theater, and that movie was, I have to say, not only as a Marvel movie, definitely by far as a Marvel movie, but I felt that movie was a completely waste of time. It was so utterly pointless, that movie, and it didn't make any sense. It just felt like the studios were reintroducing, trying to introduce these characters to kind of milk this, you know, this massive like monster of a machine that they created, through Marvel, and it was just this cash cow. They were trying to like reintroduce, and it felt like everything was forced, but yet in the big scope of things, they were forcing you to, forcing the audience to be introduced into these new characters and these, this new world, to make this into a whole other series of other films, and everything felt forced. And at the end of the day, I felt like those characters that they introduced were utterly, they had no place in the universe. It was like insignificant, and it was a completely pointless movie. And I saw that in the theater, and I was like so utterly disappointed. And I'm like, why are they doing this? Like, why am I being forced? Why am I? I'm getting this feeling of being forced. From a franchise that I love overall, like as a whole, Marvel. I felt like they're just like throwing you a bone, and they're hoping you're gonna pick on it, and that you'll want to see now, five other movies or 10 other movies in this new universe that we're trying to create. You'll pay that ticket or pay that, amount of money to see it. And it was like completely pointless. It was so unrelated to anything that we had seen before, and it was a bad, ripoff of, great characters like Wonder Woman or Superman. And it was just such a bad, um, crappy version of like this reintroduction of these characters that we've seen before, but just not in a good way. And it was a completely pointless experience. And I thought that movie was, and I saw that in the theater, unfortunately. And I thought that movie was, overall, just a terrible experience. I was just dumbfounded as to why did we sit through this? What's the point of this? It had no relation to anything, to any of the movies that we've seen before, any of the characters. No relation to the world that we've seen, the worlds that we've seen come and gone, come and go. And then I remember the other Marvel movie that I did see at that time was Shang-Chi. And Shang-Chi I thought was actually pretty good. I thought that movie was an interesting movie. It was the first kind of foray into introducing Shang-Chi, who was like a character, a superhero who, was coming out of this martial arts world. I thought he was an interesting character. Some of the fight sequences were really, really great. I thought it was a cool movie, but one thing that happened was, and I saw that in the theater too. There, the first half of that film, particularly the first kind of opening fight sequence in that film, uh, is breathtaking. It really reminded me. I'm a huge fan of, martial arts movies. I grew up watching a lot of the old school kung fu movies. Huge Jackie Chan fan. I'm a huge fan of really great high end fight choreography, and I thought this movie harkened back to that period where, there were people actually getting hurt during these fight sequences, but it was a great blending of some CGI stuff, but as well as practical effects. And some of the fight sequences in Shang-Chi I thought were just breathtaking. Particularly if you haven't seen it, there's a scenario where this whole elaborate fight sequence happens on this bus, and it's breathtaking. It's amazing. But the thing that I kind of got from that movie, or the thing that to a degree disappointed me about that film, was that after that, even though I think the film itself was good, I felt that after this incredible presentation of this amazing fight sequence, and also a really great introduction to these characters, I felt everything else was anticlimactic. Nothing was ever as exciting as that first chapter of the film. And it was still good, but I don't know, it was my enthusiasm for the movie, and I felt the momentum that movie had created kind of got lost. And it was still solid, but it was never, nothing was ever as good as the first half. I thought the characterizations were good, but particularly around the fight sequences, I felt like everything was kind of anticlimactic. So it was start off with a bang, you know, on this in this on this in this epic in this on in this epic way. But then after that, everything was kind of like anticlimactic, and then I just found myself. I liked the film a lot. I thought it was good and it was super entertaining. I saw it in the theater. I was glad I saw it in the theater. But then I came away from it thinking, well, it just wasn't. It didn't keep up that momentum. It wasn't. It didn't keep me engaged, and I felt like everything after those, the first chapter of that film, more or less, it was a little bit of a letdown. I've only seen that movie once. I do recommend people seeing that movie. I think it's really good in a lot of ways, but it's not consistent. I don't think the momentum it builds lasts very long. And I haven't seen it since then. And it is a good movie, but it was like not a movie that I was, chomping at the bit to see again. It's not a movie that I'm seeking out to buy. I probably will buy it on Blu-ray at some point, but I'm not very excited about it. Even though I thought it was good. I thought compared to the Eternals, it was a masterpiece. But and then after that, the other films that I remember coming out. Again, I haven't seen Doctor Strange. I love the first Doctor Strange. I love Doctor Strange as a character. I more or less heard the same kind of thing. The same kind of thing happened for me for Thor Ragnarok. I kind of didn't have any interest in seeing it. I just this fatigue had set in, and I was just like, I don't know. And I knew a couple of close friends that saw it, and we have a lot of the same tastes, and I know we're on the same page. And they were saying how it was really underwhelming and kind of disappointing. And I heard one of the criticisms of that film was that creatively, and Sam Raimi, the great Sam Raimi, was the director. But one of the criticisms, or some of the main criticisms I heard around that film was that they could see that there was interference, from the studio on that film, and that it really wasn't the movie that Sam Raimi necessarily wanted to make. Again, I can't make a full call on that movie because I haven't seen it. But overall, I had heard that movie was um, undercooked and it was a letdown. And at that time, I started getting this fatigue set in where I was like, for a couple minutes, I was really excited to see it, and then it just kind of waned, and I was like, I don't know, I'll eventually see it. I lost any enthusiasm that I had about seeing it in the theater. I just was like, well, I'll eventually see it on Blu-ray or rent it on DVD or whatnot. And it's been out, for rent for quite a while, and I still haven't seen it. The same thing with the new Thor movie. There's other things that I like watching more, even though, again, I haven't seen those films. So weird. Like I mentioned, my friend Erin Kirkpatrick, going through this phase of where she just, this sense of full on fatigue and exhaustion around Marvel movies had settled in. I'm kind of at that phase, and it's sad, but because I'm a huge fan of all things comic books, all things related to the comic book world. And so and then a few weeks ago I was in the theater and I saw this really terrific movie, Deadly Night, an amazing action movie, an amazing homage to the first Die Hard movie, Home Alone, just a spectacular movie. Saw that in the theater with my friend Aiden Kaczynski, who is a really great friend, and he's also I definitely consider him a fellow film fanatic. He's very much into movies, and we go to movies. We've been going to movies quite a bit, which has been a blast. And we saw Deadly Night in the theater, and I saw the trailer for the new Guardians of the Galaxy movie, which I thought looked really good. I wasn't really aware that it was coming out, but it's the third one. And then I saw the trailer for the new Indiana Jones movie, which looks okay. It looks pretty good. It's hard to see Harrison Ford being almost 90 years old, still playing an action hero. But I thought it looked good. It looked probably better, hopefully, than the last uh, movie in that franchise, which was kind of god awful, unwatchable. Um, and and then I saw the trailer for the new Ant Man, and I I do I'm a fan of Ant Man. I thought I have the first Ant Man starring Paul Rudd. I have the first film of that on Blu-ray. I recently picked it up on Blu-ray. I am a big fan of that film. I think it's a little bit on the lighter side. Obviously, I think it's pretty campy and a little bit silly. And for me, it's not on par with, say, the Captain America films, or definitely not the Avenger films and Ragnarok. But I think it's really great in a lot of ways. I think it's a real kind of enjoyable, kind of campy ride. And I love Paul Rudd a lot. I don't know. I kind of my opinion of Paul Rudd has definitely changed, especially after seeing, because last night Aiden and I went to go see the new Ant Man movie, and so like I said, we the last movie we saw in the theater, I saw the trailer um, for the new Ant Man movie, which I was unaware that was coming out, and it's called Ant Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. And I saw the trailer for it, and I was totally unaware that there was going to be a new Ant Man movie. And I thought the trailer looked really wild. I thought it looked bonkers. I thought it looked, it was going to be a real deep dive into this whole introduction of the multiverse, but then the whole quantum world, and which was a huge component, really the most major component of the Avengers Endgame. And it looked super interesting. It looked like the tone for the this new movie, the new Ant Man movie, it looked like the tone was a little bit more serious, and it looked like it was gonna be fresh and something new. But it looked really cool, and I was like, wow, I had no idea that there was a new one coming out, and so I was really interested. I was interested in seeing it. So then the other day or yesterday we saw it in the theater, and we kind of made some last minute plans to go to the movies, and I saw that this was playing last night at Flagship, so we went to the theater. The other thing that was really cool, Flagship Cinema, Kaylee Anderson, who is the manager of Flagship, she was a guest last month on Film Fanatic, and it was a really awesome show. We talked all about the ins and outs of kind of running a movie theater, essentially, but then we really focused on what that is like, trying to get people to physically come to a theater while you're dealing with you know the predicament of most people want to stay home and do the streaming thing. So the focus of the show was, that's a real tricky thing. How do you navigate toward, in that world? And it was a really great show. And she had said too that Flagship Cinema, which is in Thomaston, they were in the process of doing all of these renovations, and they were going to be putting in, a couple of new theaters, updating some of the technology that they had, the speakers and whatnot, and but they were going to be putting in these new chairs, these heated chairs that are fully reclinable. So I forgot about that, and I told Aiden about the movie, and he was into doing it. And then when we got together, we had some dinner before. He was like, "Yeah, they have these chairs now, so the place is going to be, redone." And I was like, "Oh, great, that'd be an added bonus." And we get to the theater, and the whole theater, like half the theater is closed off. All the floors are all like torn up, and it looked like a weird kind of. We had this joke where it looked like some kind of German, Eastern Bloc kind of, had this like German Eastern Bloc aesthetic. Almost felt like you were on the set of a Rammstein video. It was really weird because all the floors were stripped bare, and it looked like you were working in this, going to this like weird construction site. And half the theaters were closed too, so there was only like 3 or 4 movies there that were playing. I think there was only 3 movies playing, but it was great. We got to our seats, and the chairs were amazing. Like you literally, uh, can lay back like almost like you're laying in bed, and the chairs are heated, and that was pretty amazing. But we saw the new Ant-Man movie, and again, like I said, I like the first Ant-Man movie. I think it's really good. I don't think it's a masterpiece, or I don't think it's like as good as say the even the last Spider-Man, but I think it's good. It's entertaining. I own that on Blu-ray. I really I wasn't all growing up. I wasn't all that familiar with Ant-Man as a character, but I was a fan of the sci-fi aspect of it, the whole like quantum physics around it, and diving deep into the multi uh, universe concept, the tech around that. I always thought that was really interesting, and his powers were really interesting. The suit design I thought was always really cool. But I thought the movies that really propelled my interest of Ant Man as a character, played by Paul Rudd, was Civil War. I felt that Captain America movie is just an amazing movie, and Ant Man had a really big part in that film. And there's a whole incredible sequence in that film, which I kind of feel like he steals the show, and he's kind of incredible in that movie. And then I felt, particularly in Endgame, they really pushed his character to the forefront, and he really was probably the most integral part to that storyline because it really dove into the quantum universe and the multiverse, and how they could go back in time and time travel, and also be able to alter the timeline of particular things that happen. And it was centered around Thanos, and I thought it was fascinating what they did. But Paul Rudd as Ant Man, his character Ant Man, became kind of the hero of that whole story. Like he was probably at the end of the day the most the most integral part to that story and to where it went. And it was an incredible movie. And after that movie, I became even a more of a fan of his character. I thought it was the best portrayal of Ant Man. I thought he was, suddenly a character to be taken really seriously in the whole universe. And I thought it was awesome. I was along for the ride. So when I saw the trailer for this new one, I was really excited. Um, and I have to say, this movie. So we watched it, and I have to say, this movie was probably one of the most disappointing movies I've seen. Definitely the worst movie I've seen this year. And I have to say it's probably one of the most, or the most disappointing movies that I've seen in the Marvel universe. Um, Super overbloated. Um, I felt the writing, although it does introduce some new concepts, and it does kind of bring about, or it hints at some new and interesting ideas because it's set in that world of the quantum universe, which was talked about, was explored a lot in the previous films, but now this film is centered in the quantum universe. And I thought it could be really interesting. And I thought watching the film, it introduced some new ideas that I thought were really cool. I thought the tone of this film was a little bit more serious compared to the other Ant-Man films. There was a second Ant-Man, Ant-Man versus Wasp Man, which I thought was pretty good too. And I thought, okay, this was moving things in a little bit more of a serious, putting things in a little bit more of a serious light. This is something we might not have ever really seen before. It's a little bit more of a deep dive to a place, to a universe that we've only seen aspects of. And again, I thought it did introduce some new ideas that I thought were interesting. But I thought this movie too was such a stunning example of where the writing does take some liberty, and they want to introduce you to some new concepts and new characters, but then it relies so much on like such an utterly unoriginal development of those stories and the story, and it becomes this just totally generic plot line. My friend Aiden just talked about the film, and he kind of felt it was probably the worst Marvel movie he's ever seen. And this movie, I have to say, it was really disappointing. It really, I felt really, really ripped off so many key points of things that we've seen in all of the Star Wars movies and the Transformer movies. This was one thing that Aiden had brought up, the storyline, and it was so utterly original. Even with the Star Wars scenario, particularly what I saw that it ripped off was the whole like villain concept around the Emperor or the particularly Darth Vader. It literally was like it introduces this character um, who this new villain who I was completely unaware of, and I thought was kind of interesting, Kang the Conqueror, and it has he's and it's played by Jonathan Majors, who I had never seen before, and I thought he's a pretty good, he's a pretty solid actor. But it introduces this new villain, Kang the Conqueror, and it's a pretty cool introduction to what he does. He does have this really uh, commanding presence, but then when you kind of understand what he's about, it's literally something, and it's literally the same scenario you have seen a bazillion times, and you're just like, oh come on, like you introduce this new character that has potential and it sounds interesting, but then it becomes it felt like the writing suddenly is becomes I don't know, they run it to rely on all of these like traditional tropes that as viewers we've seen a bazillion times, where it's like paint by numbers, and the narrative is so straightforward, and his whole plight as being this villain. Uh, and like I said, I made this copy and paste analogy where it's literally, it's literally a copy and paste scenario of like of the first three movies, particularly Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and the last Star Wars movie, was it Rise of Skywalker, with the whole concept of the Emperor like being in the shadows and amassing this army. All of those scenarios where, and the whole scenario around Darth Vader and the the whole platform with how he operated and operates. It literally was such a ripoff of that, where it was literally copy. I felt like it was a copy paste scenario. You could watch both of those. You know, you could watch this presentation from this new Ant-Man movie along with those particular sequences around the Emperor and Darth Vader. Where there are these elaborate speeches that he gives, and basically where he is and what his agenda, those characters' agendas are, and it's literally the same thing. And I was just like, this is like so incredibly dumb. They could have done something that gave you something slightly original. And it was just such a bloated. And the other thing that was just so terrible was the CGI in this film. I have to say is some of the worst CGI I have ever seen. It's okay in the beginning. I thought, okay, we're getting used to this new universe. It's a very foreign thing to us. We've never really seen creatures like this. But then after about 25 minutes, I'm like, this stuff looks so artificial. There's no tangibility to it. There's nothing organic. None of these characters I really care about. And it just looked so artificial. And again, I felt like it was a ripoff of Star Wars Tatooine, the city or the town that is that we're introduced to in A New Hope. It's literally a ripoff of that, and it's also a ripoff of what James Gunn kind of did with introducing us to the Guardians of the Galaxy universe. It's like a weird hybrid of Tatooine and the Guardians of the Galaxy universe, but with the quality not being there. The CGI is terrible, and it's so artificial. I was amazed. I was amazed by how bad that it was, and after a while, I found myself not being invested in anything. Um, and it has this thing too, like it introduces these interesting characters in the beginning, but then you realize they have, they really have no um, pull or no real reason as to why they're in this film. One actor in particular, who I thought was a really cool, interesting actor, William Jackson Harper, who was introduced fairly on into this newer movie, this new Ant Man movie. Uh, I was just like, you know, he plays this character who's like has these psychic powers called Quaz, and he's actually a really interesting and cool character, but he's only in the movie for like 5 or 10 minutes, and I'm like, why is he in this? Why was he even in this movie? Like, I wanted to see him more on the screen. At that point, he was my favorite thing I had seen on the screen. I thought it was pretty funny. I thought he was like his acting was great. I thought the writing was cool. Again, it was one of those cases they introduced something new, but then he was gone for the rest of the movie, and I'm like, what is going on here? It didn't make any sense to me. And the other thing that I was just shocked, and I had no idea he was in it, but Bill Murray is in this film. Um, and I literally can't even tell you what character he played in the film. He played some kind of military political figure, and he just suddenly appears in the movie early on, and it's kind of funny, and it's like, but he's basically playing himself. He's playing like Bill Murray as an older guy, as an like an old Bill Murray, and then he just disappears for the rest of the movie. But then you realize I was like really surprised by why that Bill Murray was in the film. I didn't know he was in the film, but then I was like, why was he even in the film? He had nothing to do, like literally nothing to do with the entire story, and I was dumbfounded. Like, why was he even in the film? And after basically Bill Murray's character, I can't even really recall or understand why he was even on the screen, or what he had to do with any trying to figure out what he had to do with the story. After he kind of exited stage left, you never saw him again at all. He was literally in the movie for like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, and he had this one sequence in the movie where there was a lot of dialogue, and he was sitting around the table with these other characters, and he seemed like he might have been a key player in this movie. But then suddenly he disappears. A series of events happen, and he disappears. And then there's no reference to him at all. And then 2 minutes after 5 minutes after he is no longer in the movie, I remember just thinking to myself, like, why was he? I mean, Bill Murray's an icon, but he's been in so many great movies. But why was he just on screen and playing his old self? And what was the point of that? And then the movie the movie suffers too because it's really long. It's really long and over bloated. But after about 5 or 10 minutes after he wasn't in the film anymore, and as I watched the movie, I'm like, why was he introduced in this film? What was the point? He had no purpose in the movie other than maybe he just got, he showed up, got his paycheck, and just played himself. And it was just like, it was off-putting. It didn't really, had nothing to do with the story. And I was like, why did that happen? And there was no reference there's a little bit of an indication in the beginning when you see him that he was kind of a major player in this story, and that he had these, he was had some kind of nefarious plan, but then they didn't go into it, and then you never saw him referenced again. And I was like, why? What was that? Like that was the first time of the movie where I was just like, what is going on? Like I just didn't understand the rationality of having him in there. And along with the rest of the cast, this was the introduction of numerous other characters like Marvel movies do, but it focused a lot on the Ant-Man's daughter, who is now, you know, has her own suit, is older and has a complete, awareness, and has control of her powers, just like her father. And she's played by Catherine Newton. She plays Cassandra. Evangeline Lilly is back. She was in the other two films. She plays Hope. Tony McCarthy plays the humanoid. Paul Rudd, of course, plays Scott Lang. Michelle Pfeiffer is in this film, who is a major player in this movie, along with Michael Douglas, who plays Hank Pym. William Jackson. And the funny, and so there's a lot of, we're introduced to this entirely new universe with a bazillion new characters. The one character I thought was interesting, but then again, it just went into a direction where I was just like, this is so ham-handed and so dumb and just so such a ripoff of other things, and just really an example of something that was so poorly handled. I thought Jonathan Majors' character as King the Conqueror was cool and interesting, and I was into him. But then when it's kind of unveiled as to what his plan is and where he's coming from, you're just like, okay, I've seen this too many times. I don't really care. I don't really care about what his whole plight is. I'm not invested in him. And the strange thing is that Michelle Pfeiffer is basically kind of the lead action star of this movie, and she plays Janet Van, and she's the mother of Evangeline's. She's the mother of her character, and it's kind of centered on this family, more or less this family dynamic. She is the mother of Hope, and but the odd thing is that she kind of more or less steals the show. Like, she plays this action star, and she's basically in every frame of the movie, and also Michael Douglas. And it's really, for me, it's a hard thing. Like, I feel like certain actors, when they reach a certain age, she's 63, she still looks great, but it's so hard to get behind, senior citizens who are playing action stars. I just feel like actors, to see Michael Douglas, and he's in almost every frame of this movie, and he's essentially an action star in this movie, more so than even Paul Rudd is. To see them kind of carrying the weight of the action and all of these elaborate scenes, is so hard to watch, because the actors are past their prime. I feel like they need to, and I know for them they have their icons in Hollywood, but I feel like they need to know when to say when. Maybe they're way past their golden years, and they can't really carry a movie like that. So for me, it was impossible to buy into this idea that she was going to be this person, or this character that was basically involved in every sequence that we were seeing, all of these action sequences, and she was essentially like, it was like her movie in some ways, more so than Paul Rudd as Ant-Man. And it was so unbelievable watching, unbelievable to kind of comprehend seeing these senior citizens on the screen that are clearly not, they're not the right age to be playing these roles, and it doesn't make any sense. And it just took me out of the movie. And I'm like, these actors, I feel like they have to know when to say when. I think one other example of that, and it's just, it's to an extreme point, but I think one actor that does that, and I can't even watch his movies anymore, that has no idea when to say when, is Clint Eastwood. Amazing actor. He's got an amazing body of work as an actor and as a director. But his last few films, he plays the lead, and he's too he's just way too old to be playing a lead actor. He's still got some chops as a director, but he clearly has no idea of when to say when, and to kind of step out of that and being like, well, I'm in this other graceful part of my life I need to reserve it for other people, younger actors, and know when to say when. But this movie, even though Michelle Pfeiffer and Michael Douglas are not in their 90s, it's still a thing that I couldn't believe that these senior citizens are carrying this movie and doing all of these elaborate sequences. Like, it was impossible and it was ridiculous, and it took me completely out of the movie. Um, and the other thing too that this movie suffers from, and it's a thing that it's part of the movie, the whole franchise, all of the Marvel movies, is it tries to always have this like whimsical, childlike humor, and a lot of the films, it really works. I think for the Avenger films, it works. It's really fun and entertaining. It keeps things on a lighter side, even though they do deal with like some heavy duty, adult kind of concepts. And I like some of that humor quite a bit, but it's become so cliche in all of these movies. And they try to do that a lot in this film, and it is painful. It's painful. It's painful to sit through. There's certain sequences with Michelle Pfeiffer's character, and particularly around Michael Douglas's character. It is generally excruciatingly painful to sit through, and it's I was just flabbergasted. There's like these sequences where he'll say something so utterly ridiculous and cliche and just just incredibly cheesy and ridiculous and stupid. And and there's like this big pause and there's nothing going on and it's silent, and then the camera's on those characters, and they say something that you feel like it was written by a 5-year-old kid, like, and that's supposed to be something funny, or that's supposed to be ironic, or ha ha ha, here's where you're supposed to laugh, and you're just like, my reaction was just like, really, like, this is terrible. And it's got that throughout the movie, that is just so bad, and it was just, you know painful to watch. And this film, I have to say, is way too long. There were moments where it never usually happens for me for a movie, but there were moments during this film that I literally started to fall asleep because it's so long. It's so long, and it has that thing of where there's these tacked on endings. There's like two or three endings to this film where you feel like, okay, it's going to end and it's coming to this climax. And then, no, something else happens. And then all of this other stuff ensues. And it just goes on and on. And it was exhausting. I got my second win and I watched the rest of the movie, but it was too long. It was too over bloated. The biggest component of it that was the most disappointing was the CGI. I thought that CGI was uh, an example of all things. It represented all things of why I don't like CGI. There are really great examples of that, but this was so poorly handled and executed. And trying to blend the live action with the CGI was just like unbelievably bad. So terrible. Um, you know, Aiden and I had gone to see the new Avatar movie, and I think it's a good movie. I was glad I saw it. Again, not the most original story, but better than the first one. But it was still a good experience. The CGI and the tech in that movie is like unlike anything I've ever seen before. And I just saw that recently. And this was not even something you could bring up in the same sentence in comparison. Like, I don't know what, I kind of don't know what they were thinking. It felt like this movie was, well, again, it's so over bloated, but it felt like maybe the studios was they were they were trying to. It felt like this movie was rushed as far as the production side of things. It felt like nothing was seamless. You could see the live action and where it met with the CGI. Like you could see those lines. It never was at a seamless. Um, it never met at this like seamless point. It was so obvious where things were and where things were kind of being cut, and tried to be, and where they were trying to kind of tie it together. But it was so, to me, it was um, so obvious that it wasn't working. And yeah, I was really disappointed. I thought, because like again, like I said, with Endgame and a few of the other incarnations, Civil War, I thought those were really great, incredible versions, particularly Endgame, the best uh, telling of and the strongest presentation of Ant Man that I'd ever seen. It really made me interested in this character, and I thought, okay, this is something worth paying attention to, and I'm digging this. And to see what they've done with this movie, where it could have been, I think, really fantastic. It was so utterly disappointing, and I kind of feel like this movie might be definitely the worst movie I've seen. It's right up there with the Eternals. The Eternals is unwatchable though. Like that's flat out just just a waste of time on every in like on every level, in every level and on every level. And I feel like this is right up there. I mean, this has a little bit some ideas and some things, some aspects to it that I think are kind of interesting and slightly entertaining, but that's not saying much. I don't recommend people seeing this in the theater, and I have to say it's almost sad to admit to it, but generally now the fatigue has is full on for me as far as Marvel movies. I'm kind of done with watching new Marvel movies. I'm kind of fatigued. I kind of lost an interest in seeing anything else. I'm not invested in to see where this whole Phase Five thing will go because I'm just like, just give it a fucking break. So, so thanks again. This is Jason Dean. This was a long show. There was a lot to talk about. I just saw this last night, so I've been processing and thinking about this movie on a lot of levels. And we've been talking about it a lot. Aiden and I've been talking about it, and so you know, I had a lot on my mind around this film, and it shows that this review, because it was an hour, 1 hour and 18 minutes. But thanks again. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe to it. Thanks again to all the awesome people out there, people that I know personally and people that I've met online, that show their support for this wacky channel that I do. So this is Jason Dean, and I'm going to sign off for today. Have a great day. Peace.